No one could have predicted what would unfold that cold November night in 1983 at Detroit's Cobo Hall. Marvin Gaye was at the peak of his career, but as he stood on that stage, he was transported back to his childhood. When he spotted his father in the crowd, the soul legend crumbled under the weight of traumas he had suppressed for years. In an instant, he wasn't the 44-year-old superstar anymore. He was the 8-year-old boy who had been beaten by his father. The recordings from that night reveal one of the music world's most painful truths. If you're fascinated by the untold stories behind music's greatest legends, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. What happened that night would change everything we thought we knew about the Prince of Soul. The autumn air was crisp as fans filed into Cobo Hall, anticipating another electrifying performance from Marvin Gaye. The Sexual Healing Tour had been a triumphant return after years of European exile, cocaine addiction, and financial ruin. Berry Gordy watched as his former golden boy clawed his way back to relevance. But success had not healed the wounds that ran deepest in Marvin's psyche, the scars left by a man who should have been his protector but instead became his tormentor. The true depth of this abuse wouldn't be fully understood until that November night, when father and son came face to face in the most public arena imaginable. From the earliest days of Marvin's childhood in Washington, D.C., the household at 1625 First Street Southwest was a battlefield. Marvin Gaye Sr. was a minister in the House of God, a strict Pentecostal sect that forbade dancing, drinking, and ironically the very music that would make his son famous. Behind the facade of religious devotion lurked a cross-dressing alcoholic who unleashed savage brutality on his children that left scars lasting decades. The House of God doctrine taught that suffering was a path to salvation, and Marvin Sr. seemed determined to ensure his children's salvation through pain. Alberta Gaye would later recount how her husband beat the children with belts, extension cords, and his bare hands for the smallest infractions. But Marvin Jr. bore the brunt of his father's wrath, perhaps because he reminded Marvin Sr. of his own failed ambitions, or because the boy's obvious musical talent represented everything the strict religious doctrine forbade. What made the abuse even more devastating was how it intertwined with Marvin's earliest exposure to music, creating a complex relationship between creativity and trauma that would define his entire career. The beatings weren't just physical punishment, they were psychological warfare. Marvin Sr. forced his son to strip naked before administering beatings, a humiliation that went beyond discipline into sadistic control. Young Marvin learned to anticipate his father's moods, reading subtle signs that indicated another violent episode was approaching. The sound of footsteps on stairs, the particular way he cleared his throat, the smell of alcohol, all became triggers that haunted Marvin for life. Despite the violence, young Marvin found solace in music. The irony wasn't lost that his father, who preached against secular music, had a beautiful singing voice that Marvin inherited. In the House of God, only religious music was permitted. But even within those constraints, Marvin's talent was undeniable. He played drums, piano, and sang in the church choir, displaying natural musicality that amazed congregants and frustrated his father equally. The psychological damage from this emotional whiplash would later manifest in ways that shocked even those closest to Marvin, including incidents kept secret for decades. One incident, never publicly disclosed until years after Marvin's death, occurred when he was 16. Marvin Sr. discovered his son had been secretly listening to Sam Cooke records on a radio hidden under his mattress. The beating that followed was so severe Marvin couldn't attend school for a week, his body covered in welts and bruises his mother desperately tried to conceal. But what happened after the physical assault truly damaged the teenager's psyche. Marvin Sr. forced his son to destroy the radio with a hammer while he watched, making the boy repeat that secular music was the devil's work. As Marvin smashed the device that brought him joy, something fundamental broke inside him, not just his spirit, but his ability to fully trust his own desires and instincts. This incident would later influence one of Marvin's most controversial decisions as an adult, a choice that stunned the music industry and revealed the depth of his psychological wounds. The escape came in 1957 when Marvin enlisted in the Air Force, but military service couldn't provide refuge. The rigid discipline and authoritarian structure triggered his trauma responses, and he found himself unable to cope with another environment where men in power could control and punish him. After less than a year, Marvin received an early discharge for psychological reasons. Returning to Washington meant returning to his father's house. But now Marvin was determined to pursue music professionally. He formed the Marquis and began performing in local venues, keeping activities secret from his father. When Marvin Sr. inevitably discovered his son's musical pursuits, The confrontation was explosive, resulting in Marvin leaving home permanently rather than submit to another beating. But Marvin couldn't have known that his troubles with father figures were far from over, and that Berry Gordy would eventually become another source of conflict echoing his childhood patterns. By 1961, Marvin caught Berry Gordy Jr.'s attention. The move to Detroit represented more than a career opportunity. It was a chance to create a new identity, a new family, hopefully a new relationship with father figures who might nurture rather than destroy his artistic gifts. The early Motown years were a revelation. For the first time, Marvin was surrounded by people who appreciated his musical talents and actively encouraged their development. Berry Gordy became something of a surrogate father, and while their relationship would later complicate, those early days provided validation and support Marvin had never received at home. Marvin's marriage to Anna Gordy, Berry's sister, in 1963 further cemented his place in the Motown family. Anna was 17 years older, a mature woman who seemed to understand his need for both maternal comfort and creative freedom. For a brief period, it appeared Marvin had successfully escaped childhood trauma and built a new life based on love and artistic expression rather than fear and violence. What made these psychological scars even more dangerous was how they began to manifest in Marvin's relationship with substances, setting the stage for destructive patterns that would ultimately lead him back to his father's house on that fatal day in 1984. The late 1960s brought triumph and tragedy. I Heard It Through the Grapevine established him as one of music's most important voices. But Tammy Terrell's death from a brain tumor in 1970 left him emotionally devastated. Tammy had represented the possibility of pure, uncomplicated love, and her loss reawakened all his abandonment fears rooted in childhood trauma. During this grief period, Marvin first began experimenting seriously with cocaine. Initially, the drug provided emotional numbness he craved, allowing him to perform without feeling the full weight of psychological pain. But cocaine also amplified his paranoia and hypervigilance, traits already pronounced due to childhood abuse. He became convinced people were plotting against him, that his phone was tapped, that even close friends couldn't be trusted. But it was the release of What's Going On in 1971 that brought Marvin into direct conflict with Berry Gordy, triggering a dynamic eerily similar to his relationship with his father. Berry Gordy's initial rejection of What's Going On as uncommercial sent Marvin into surprising rage. The song was deeply personal, inspired by brother Frankie's Vietnam stories and Marvin's own alienation. When Gordy dismissed it, he wasn't just rejecting music, he was rejecting Marvin's attempt to address serious social issues through art. The confrontation replayed psychological patterns from Marvin's relationship with his father. Here was another powerful older man telling him his instincts were wrong, his artistic vision worthless, that he should stick to what he was told rather than follow creative impulses. Though Marvin ultimately prevailed, the song became a massive hit. The wound of that initial rejection never healed. This self-destructive pattern would reach its peak during the recording of Here My Dear, an album that shocked the music industry and revealed how deeply Marvin's psychological wounds had infected his ability to maintain healthy relationships. The breakdown of Marvin's marriage to Anna Gordy activated every abandonment fear he'd carried since childhood. The bitter divorce proceedings demanded substantial alimony Marvin felt was punitive. In a move that was both creative genius and psychological revenge, he decided to fulfill alimony obligations by recording an album about their relationship and giving Anna the royalties. Here My Dear was unlike anything in popular music, a brutally honest examination of failed marriage that spared no one. While critics debated the artistic merits of airing personal laundry publicly, those close to Marvin recognized something more disturbing. He had become obsessed with the project, spending months crafting what was essentially musical psychological warfare against his ex-wife. But it was during this period that Marvin's cocaine use escalated from recreational to life-threatening, and parallels between his addiction and his father's alcoholism became impossible to ignore. By the late 70s, Marvin's cocaine addiction affected every aspect of life. He missed recording sessions, showed up late for concerts, and alienated friends with increasingly erratic behavior. The drug that once provided escape had become another source of trauma, creating cycles of use, guilt, withdrawal, and relapse that mirrored the unpredictable violence of his childhood home. The irony wasn't lost on those who knew Marvin's history. His father's alcoholism drove the abuse Marvin suffered as a child, and now Marvin was recreating those same patterns with cocaine. The hypervigilance, mood swings, paranoid accusations, all eerily reminiscent of Marvin Sr.'s behavior during his worst drinking episodes. The move to Europe in 1981 was supposed to be a fresh start, but instead became the beginning of the final chapter in a tragedy decades in the making. Marvin's exile to Belgium was initially motivated by tax problems and escape from American fame pressures, but geography couldn't solve fundamental psychological issues. Cut off from established support systems and struggling with European culture's unfamiliarity, Marvin's cocaine use spiraled completely out of control. European fans and journalists described a man fighting invisible demons. He'd show up for interviews clearly under the influence, rambling about conspiracies while displaying the hollow-eyed look of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. The few concerts he performed were erratic affairs, with Marvin sometimes stopping mid-song to address imaginary hecklers. The success of Sexual Healing seemed to herald a triumphant comeback, but those closest to Marvin noticed that his psychological issues remained unresolved, setting the stage for the confrontation that would occur at Cobo Hall. The decision to return to America in 1983 was motivated partly by Sexual Healing's success and partly by Marvin's deteriorating mental state. The Sexual Healing tour was designed to celebrate his artistic resurrection, but for Marvin, it represented something more complex, a chance to confront the ghosts of his past while surrounded by thousands of fans' adulation. Early tour shows were generally successful, though those working closely with Marvin noticed troubling signs. He was still using cocaine regularly and had become increasingly preoccupied with his father, whom he hadn't seen in years. Marvin would often bring up Marvin Sr. in conversations, alternating between expressions of hatred and surprising vulnerability, where he seemed to long for reconciliation. It was this psychological state, a volatile mixture of unresolved trauma, ongoing addiction, and desperate hope for healing that Marvin carried when he took the stage at Cobo Hall on November 15, 1983. The Cobo Hall concert was scheduled as a Sexual Healing tour highlight. Detroit held special significance as the city where his career truly began, and the venue was packed with longtime fans. The atmosphere was electric as Marvin took the stage, his sequin jacket catching lights as he launched into the opening number. For the first two songs, everything proceeded normally. Marvin was in good voice, the band was tight, and the crowd responded enthusiastically. But as he began the third song, a soulful ballad requiring him to look directly into the audience, something shifted. Those watching from wings later described seeing Marvin's expression change dramatically, as if he'd seen something shocking. What Marvin had seen was his father, Marvin Gaye Sr., sitting in the fifth row, watching his son perform with an expression mixing pride, disapproval, and something harder to define. For a man already struggling with severe childhood trauma and ongoing substance abuse, seeing his abuser sitting calmly among fans was overwhelming. The moment their eyes met across the crowded venue, more than 20 years of suppressed rage, fear, and desperate longing for approval came flooding back, and the 44-year-old international superstar was instantly transformed back into the terrified child he had once been. Marvin stopped singing mid-word, his voice trailing off as the band continued playing. The audience initially thought it was artistic choice, but as seconds stretched into uncomfortable eternity, it became clear something was seriously wrong. Marvin stood frozen at the microphone, staring into the crowd with pure terror, visible even from back rows. It was the drummer who finally stopped playing, creating complete silence that echoed through the 15,000-seat venue. In that silence, those close enough could hear Marvin mumbling under his breath. Later, lip readers analyzing video footage claimed he was repeatedly saying, he's here, why is he here?" in a voice sounding more like a frightened child than an international superstar. What happened next would become one of the most talked-about incidents in live performance history, as Marvin began to speak directly to his father from the stage, revealing family secrets that shocked even those who thought they knew his story. Breaking away from the microphone stand, Marvin walked to the stage edge, eyes locked on where his father sat. The venue's acoustics carried every sound, so when Marvin began speaking in a voice that grew steadily louder and more emotionally charged, every word was audible throughout the arena. "You came to watch me perform," Marvin said, his voice carrying disbelief and decades of suppressed anger. "After everything you did to me, you came to watch me sing. Do you remember the belt? Do you remember making me strip naked before you beat me? Do you remember telling me my music was the devil's work while you stood there drunk in your dress?" The audience was stunned into silence. This wasn't typical between-song banter. This was something far more raw and uncomfortable, a public confrontation between son and abuser that no one was prepared to witness. But Marvin wasn't finished. The floodgates had opened, and 25 years of suppressed trauma came pouring out in a torrent that would haunt everyone present for the rest of their lives. "I used to pray that you would love me," Marvin continued, his voice now clearly audible throughout the venue. I used to think that if I could just be good enough, if I could just sing well enough in church, maybe you would stop hurting me. But nothing was ever good enough for you, was it? And now you're here, watching me succeed, and I still feel like that scared little boy waiting for the next beating. The emotional rawness created an atmosphere unlike anything most concertgoers had experienced. This wasn't entertainment. It was witnessing someone's psychological breakdown in real time. Some audience members began to cry. Others started to leave, but most remained frozen, unsure how to process what they were hearing. The incident continued for nearly 8 minutes as Marvin alternated between addressing his father directly and speaking to the audience about childhood abuse's impact on his life and career. He talked about how beatings taught him to expect punishment for success, how his father's violence made it difficult to trust anyone, and how shame drove him to seek validation through fame and substances. But perhaps most shocking was when Marvin began connecting his father's abuse to his own self-destructive behavior, revealing insights about addiction and trauma that wouldn't become common knowledge in psychology circles for another decade. "You taught me that I deserved to suffer," Marvin said, his voice barely above a whisper but still audible. "Every time you beat me, you told me it was because I was bad, because I had done something wrong. And I believed you. I still believe you. That's why I keep hurting myself with drugs, why I keep choosing pain over pleasure, why I can't let myself be truly happy even when everything is going right." This psychological insight was remarkable for someone in severe emotional crisis. It suggested that despite ongoing struggles with addiction and trauma, Marvin had spent considerable time thinking about connections between childhood experiences and adult behavior. The audience was witnessing not just a breakdown but profound self-awareness that was both heartbreaking and educational. It was Marvin himself who finally brought the incident to a close, but not before delivering one final statement that would haunt everyone present and provide crucial insight into the tragedy that would unfold 5 months later. Looking directly at his father one last time, Marvin spoke words many would later interpret as prophecy of his own death. "I can't keep running from you forever. Someday this has to end. One way or another, this has to end." The finality in his voice sent chills through the audience, though most interpreted it as simply an emotional confrontation's conclusion rather than the literal prediction it would prove to be. Without another word, Marvin walked off stage, leaving his band, the audience, and his father in stunned silence. An announcement was made that the concert was over due to medical emergency. What they had witnessed wasn't the concert they'd paid for, but something far more significant, a raw, unfiltered look at fame's psychological cost and childhood trauma's long-term effects. The aftermath of the Cobo Hall incident rippled through the music industry and Marvin's personal life in ways that would ultimately lead to the tragic conclusion of this father-son story. Against all advice, Marvin moved back into the house on South Gramercy Place where his parents lived. His stated reason was that his mother needed care, but those close suspected Marvin was still seeking resolution with his father, a final confrontation that would either heal their relationship or destroy it completely. The months between Cobo Hall and Marvin's death in April 1984 were marked by increasing tension and psychological deterioration. Living with his father triggered constant trauma responses, making emotional stability impossible. His cocaine use became virtually constant, and his paranoia reached alarming levels. The shots that ended Marvin Gaye's life also ended one of the most complex and tragic father-son relationships in entertainment history, but the psychological insights revealed by their story continue to resonate decades later. When Marvin Gaye Sr. pulled the trigger that Easter morning, he wasn't just ending his son's life, he was completing a cycle of violence and trauma that had begun decades earlier. The 44-year-old man who died was in many ways still the frightened child who had endured years of abuse without protection from the very person who should have been his greatest advocate. The Cobo Hall incident, viewed in retrospect, represents a crucial moment when intervention might still have been possible. If Marvin had received appropriate trauma therapy following his public breakdown, if his family had recognized the severity of his psychological crisis, any of these factors might have changed the outcome. The man who sang "What's Going On" in Sexual Healing, who brought joy to millions, was simultaneously carrying wounds so deep they ultimately proved fatal. His story serves as a reminder that fame, wealth, and artistic achievement cannot heal psychological damage inflicted during childhood without proper intervention and support. The echoes of that November night at Cobo Hall continue to resonate, serving as a stark reminder that sometimes the most powerful performances are not the ones that entertain us, but the ones that force us to confront uncomfortable truths about trauma, family, and the complex relationship between artistic genius and personal pain.